Hello, this is Joe Scrivener. I am the pastor of Brown Memorial Presbyterian Church. I'm also the Dean of Chapel at Stillman College, and I am coming to you at the invitation of Pastor Jeremiah Chester. It is my delight to share this video with you at St. Mark Baptist Church in Huntsville. I will simply provide an overview of the issue of slavery in Scripture. I'll make you aware of some key passages and then give you some general implications. And then I look forward to joining you in Bible study this evening. So I don't want to spend too much time. I won't take up too much time on the video, but I do want to give you a basic orientation of the issue of slavery in Holy Scripture. All right, the first thing is simply to be aware that slavery is in the Bible. One key place that I invite your attention is Exodus chapter 21. I'll read verse 2 and then verses 20 and 21. Again, this is Exodus chapter 21, verse 2, and then verses 20 and 21. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the seventh he shall go out a free slave without debt. When a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod, and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. Again, that is Exodus chapter 21, verse 2 and verses 20 and 21. That is from the New Revised Standard Version. All of my translations will be from the New Revised Standard Version. And as we talk tonight, we can compare translations and I can answer any questions you have. One key thing that I want you to make a note of in Exodus 21 is what is said at the very end of verse 21. Notice that the slave is described as property of the slave owner. So there in Exodus chapter 21, right after the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, God gives the 10 Commandments to Moses in Exodus chapter 20. In the next chapter, you have various laws laid out, and slavery is in Exodus 21, and you have this description about what should be done if a slave is killed or hurt. All right, that is Exodus 21, verse 2 and verses 20 and 21. Now I want to read one verse from Deuteronomy chapter 20. Before I do, make note of Exodus chapter 21, verses 2 through 11, the first section of Exodus 21. Please make note of Exodus 21, verses 2 through 11. Also make note of Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 12 through 18. So in addition to the verses I read to you from Exodus 21, please make note of verses 2 through 11 in Exodus 21. Also make note of Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 12 through 18. Now listen to Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 14. You may, however, take as your booty or prize or spoil the women, the children, livestock, and everything else in the town, all its spoil. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. That is Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 14. This is describing what the Israelites can do when they defeat an enemy of a town or a city outside the Canaanites. They cannot take anything from the Canaanites, according to Deuteronomy chapter 20. In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 7 and Deuteronomy chapter 20 command the complete annihilation of the Canaanites. And that's a topic for another day for your pastor, for Pastor Chester. But I do want you to note regarding slavery that in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 14, they are allowed to take defeated people as their slaves. They are the spoils of war. This translation I'm reading, the New Revised Standard Version, calls it booty or spoils. It means the winnings of war, the things they can take from the battle. So again, notice that slavery is allowed. If you defeat someone, you can take their people as your slaves. All right, those are two passages from the Old Testament. Most of the passages about slavery are in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, and I've given you those passages, primarily Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, and Deuteronomy chapter 20. Now, just to give you a sense of the presence of slavery in the New Testament, I want to read you one passage from Luke chapter 17. This is Jesus teaching, and Jesus says in Luke chapter 17, verses 7 and 8, "Who among you would say to your slave who has just come in from plowing or tending sheep in the field, 'Come here at once and take your place at the table'? Would you not rather say to him, 'Prepare supper for me, put on your apron and serve me while I eat and drink. Later you may eat and drink'?" Again, that is Luke chapter 17, verses 7 and 8. And what we see here is that Jesus is making a point about service, and he is using slavery as an illustration. Jesus does this often. Sometimes our translations obscure this a bit. The King James Version would translate the Greek word doulos. The Greek word for slave is doulos in the New Testament, D-O-U-L-O-S. And the King James Version would often translate that word as servant in the Gospels, but then translate it as slave in Paul's letters. But we see here with the New Revised Standard Version, that translation renders that word as a slave, and we see Jesus making a point using slavery. Jesus does this again in Luke chapter 12, verses 35 through 40, and in verses 41, Luke chapter 12, verses 35 through 40, and then again in verses 41 and 48 of Luke 12, same chapter. Also in Luke chapter 14, verses 16 through 24. You have it in other parables. Just if you were to Google on a Bible app the word servant in the King James Version, and you can see many of the parables have a servant in the story. Jesus uses servant or slave. And so I just want you to make you aware that slavery existed at the time of Jesus. And Jesus uses slavery to make points, spiritual points, to make moral lessons. He doesn't address the issue of slavery itself, but he does use slavery in his teaching. And that just tells us at least that slavery was widespread, it was assumed, and generally accepted. So Jesus uses slavery in his teachings, and we see one example of that in Luke 17. I also point you to Luke chapter 12 and Luke chapter 14. The other passages, the next set of passages are from Paul's letters. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 21 through 22. There the Apostle Paul says this: "Were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. Even if you can gain your freedom, make use of your present condition now more than ever. For whoever was called in the Lord as a slave is a free person belonging to the Lord, just as whoever was free when called is a slave of Christ." So here in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul addresses the issue of slavery and whether one can obtain one's freedom or not. This at least tells us that there were some slaves in the congregation at Corinth that Paul is writing to in his letter to the Corinthians. And he addresses this issue of slavery and how important slavery is or should not be. So again, just make note of that slavery is there, that it's used, and that Paul addresses it in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And I read verses 21 and 22. Another passage that's relatively famous or infamous is Ephesians chapter 6, and I'll read verses 5 and 6. "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, and singleness of heart, as you obey Christ, not only while being watched and in order to please them, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart." That's Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. You have a very similar passage in Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 through 25. So there you have the writer. The writer is presented as the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 6. And this writer is commanding slaves to obey their masters and not simply do it to be seen, but do it from sincerity of heart. 1 Peter chapter 2 is a challenging passage about slavery. Specifically, I will read 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 through 20. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 through 20. "Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval." Again, that's 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 through 20. And this passage is very difficult because it specifically addresses suffering, and it addresses being beaten. So please make note of that the issue of being beaten as a slave is mentioned here in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 through 20. So those are some key passages on slavery in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. There are other passages that may implicitly undermine slavery, and we can talk about these later. One passage is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 17 through 24. Another passage is Galatians chapters 3 and 4. That's where we have the famous verse, Galatians chapter 3, verse 23. There's neither slave nor free, Jew or Gentile, male or female. So just be aware of that. That's again in Galatians chapters 3 and 4. And then Paul's letter to Philemon about the runaway slave, what appears to be a runaway slave. And Paul encourages the owner to take him back as a brother and not as a slave. And we can talk about that. That's a letter that's only one chapter, and it's very short. A lot we don't know what's going on, but it appears that a slave has run away, and Paul is writing to the master and asking the master, pleading with the master, and attempting to persuade the master to receive the runaway slave as a brother and not as a slave. And Paul exerts a little pressure on him in light of their relationship. And we can talk about that as well. So here are some key implications I want to draw out for you and raise these up. And again, we can talk about them when we see each other for Bible study. The first implication is that slavery is human ownership for a definite or indefinite period. Variations do not negate this fact. Slavery is human ownership for a definite or indefinite period. Variations in slavery do not negate this fact. Sometimes when people talk about slavery in the Bible, they want to downplay its presence there. Slavery is in the Bible. Slavery was human ownership. There was variation in slavery. Slavery in the Bible is not racial. Slavery in the Bible is not transatlantic. Usually it's a result of war or debt or some other things. So there are some variations. The Bible, racial slavery, racist slavery came along in the 15, 16, and 1700s in Europe. So it is not that. What we have in the Bible is not what developed in Europe and in America in terms of being race-based. But it was human ownership. There was some variation. You could have some slave owners who were very harsh. You could have some that were kind. You could have some slaves who had some freedom, who could manage property for their owners. You have lots of variation throughout world history in slavery. And we want to acknowledge that there was variation. But it is still human ownership. There's variation, but it is human ownership. And it's not a metaphor. When the passages refer to slavery, the passages I read, those passages are not metaphor. There are metaphors about slavery. Paul describes himself as a slave of Jesus Christ, as an apostle. There, Paul is using slavery as a metaphor. He is bound to Christ. He is indebted to Christ. He is, quote unquote, owned by Christ. That is slavery as a metaphor. But there was literal human ownership in the Bible, and we see it in the passages I've read as well as in a few others. So slavery is human ownership. Variations in it does not negate that fact. Western Christendom, Christianity, took more than 1,800 years to come to the conclusion that slavery is immoral. So slavery is in the Bible. There are not explicit commands condemning slavery in the Bible. And it took a long time for Christians to come to the point where they decided slavery was immoral and not in agreement with God's will. It took until the 1800s, the 19th century, before Christians came to that conclusion. All right, another implication is that God did not transcend the biblical writers' time and place when they addressed slavery. God accommodated this aspect of finite, fallen humanity when inspiring the Bible. I am a pastor. I am a professor of the Bible. I believe in God's inspiration of the Bible. Yet what is in the Bible leads me to conclude that God addressed the people in the time in which they lived. God did not transcend their time and place. God sometimes works miracles with prophecy, and there are miracles of healing and other things in the Bible. But when the biblical writers address slavery, God does not give them tons of information way ahead of their time. God inspires them and works through them, and slavery exists at that time, and God did not inspire them to directly condemn it. So again, you can believe in the inspiration of the Bible and also acknowledge the existence of slavery in the Bible, and you must conclude, I believe, that God accommodated the use of slavery, or God accommodated the presence of slavery. God did not directly prohibit it in the Bible. And so we see that Christians have to discern what is right. And unfortunately, it took Christians almost 2,000 years to get to that point. All right, another implication. The issue of slavery was the first direct challenge to the belief that one could easily follow direct commands in the Bible. When we argued about slavery in the United States in the 1850s and the 1860s, and even afterwards, of course before as well, some Christians, pro-slavery Christians, simply read the passages that I read to you and others and said, if God wanted it to be known as sin, God would have told us directly in the Bible that slavery is sin. And so the issue of slavery was the first issue where Christians had to use what I call, and what Pastor Chester remembers my teaching in classes, I call principles through particulars. And so I think that with the abolitionists, with the black and white abolitionists during the time of slavery, they had to realize and they had to discern an important interpretive principle, that you can discern principles from the Bible even when those principles are told in particular stories and in particular passages. So Jesus may teach something about humility, Jesus may teach something about obedience, and Jesus may use slavery to make that point. But that does not necessarily mean that God endorses slavery, because Jesus uses slavery to make that point. The Apostle Paul may talk about figuring out what's wise in a situation, discerning whether you should do A or B. And the Apostle Paul may use slavery to make that point, because slavery existed in his world. That does not mean that we have to condone slavery, or we have to think that slavery is okay. And so I developed a phrase called principles through particulars. What's the principle of the passage? What's the big idea in the passage? And then how is that principle taught in the particulars of the story? All right, so that addresses issues in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament. It's not an easy issue to think through, but what I want you to discern is that the abolitionists, when they argued against slavery as Christians, they discerned that a larger principle that they had to follow would be the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And they reasoned rightly, I believe, guided by God and the Holy Spirit, that they would not want to be slaves. And if the golden rule requires my doing to others what I want done to me, then I should not hold slaves. So in their minds and in their arguments, and I think they were right, they said the golden rule was more important as a larger principle than the individual particular passages on slavery. They believed that honoring God meant following the golden rule and interpreting the Bible in light of the golden rule. All right, so that's another implication, the issue that sometimes the issue of slavery teaches us that sometimes you cannot read God's will directly off the page of the Bible by simply reading every command in the Bible. The Bible is not an encyclopedia. You don't just turn to a passage on slavery and always get God's will directly off the verse. Sometimes you have to think about it more deeply. Sometimes you have to think about the history and the tradition and the culture at the time the Bible was written. All right, so that's the issue of not being able to read the Bible, read God's will always directly off the page. And related to that is the issue of having to think about principles through particulars, especially the golden rule. The last thing I would say is that the last implication is that we need to understand that the Bible was inspired over a period of time. The Bible was composed over a 1,000-year period, including the Old Testament and the New Testament. and that Jesus Christ is the final revelation. Jesus Christ is the ultimate revelation, and Jesus Christ is the defining event, the defining person. And Jesus Christ is the person and the event who defines who God is. Jesus Christ defines God's character. So as we think about what Christ teaches in the Gospels, as we think about how Christ died for us, how Christ models self-sacrifice for us, how Philippians 2 tells us that he gave up himself, he sacrificed himself for us, for humanity. He gave up his place in heaven, you might say, thinking about the old Andre Crouch song. Christ modeled for us, and Christ showed us as God's Son a sense of self-sacrifice, of emptying himself, according to Philippians 2. And Christ shows us that that is the ultimate example of God's love. And so Jesus Christ is the ultimate definition. This is clear in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. The writer says that God has spoken in various ways through the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son, who is the exact imprint of God's character. So I would argue, my perspective is that Jesus Christ is the ultimate way we define who God is, and it's the ultimate, Jesus Christ is the ultimate rule for interpretation. So for me, I would argue Jesus Christ is the ultimate rule of interpretation, and the golden rule would be an accompanying rule for interpretation. Christ defining God's character and the golden rule. So those are some key passages on slavery. Those are some key implications on slavery. I will send a handout with this video, and I look forward to seeing you all in Bible study tonight. See you soon. God bless you.